In that magical, far-off, and strange time of the early 2000s, a lot of book series were taking the YA and younger reader world by storm. But if you look at the big names from that time, you'll notice a trend. Fantasy, fantasy, and more fantasy. Wizards, talking animals, you get the idea, but hard sci-fi with spaceships, not so much. However, there was one very notable exception. I'm talking, of course, about Ender's Game, a book that didn't just make its mark, it burned itself into the genre. It's a sci-fi staple, endlessly debated by fans, and somehow one of the most brilliant series ever, while simultaneously also being one of the most insane. And with its author, Orson Scott Card, being about as controversial as they come, to the point where his views have sparked massive boycotts of his works. Now, like a lot of people, I was obsessed with the first book growing up. I must have read it at least 4 times, then devoured the sequel, and then, well, life happened and I kind of fell off. So lately I got curious, what actually happened to the Ender's Game series? Did it wrap up after a few books or did it quietly fade away? Oh no, no. It's been busy with more books, more spin-offs, more controversy, and of course even a Hollywood adaptation with its own fair share of drama that came and went. So in this video, I'm diving into its wild history, its unique ideas, its many twists and turns, the history of books and sub-series, and finally taking a look at where everything is at today to explore whatever happened to Ender's Game. Hi everyone, my name is Otto and welcome to Exits Examines. We will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome. Okay, so how does one go about explaining the Ender's Game series? Honestly, I don't even really know where to start. To do a full deep dive, I'd probably need at least 2 hours, 3 whiteboards, and probably a few stiff drinks. Now, you might think you know Ender's Game. Maybe you've read the book, maybe you've even seen the movie, but even if you haven't, you've probably at least heard of it. After all, it's the 1985 novel by Orson Scott Card, selling millions of copies and proving to be hugely influential in the sci-fi genre. But trust me when I say that there are levels to this. If you're one of the many people who stopped at the first book, you might be surprised to learn that, well, the story never really ended. We're talking about decades of sequels, prequels, short stories, spin-offs, and the books are still coming out 40 years later. Now, what starts as a simple military sci-fi novel about kids training to fight aliens quickly spirals into something else entirely. The later books dive deep into philosophy, morality, and some truly wild sci-fi concepts, but then also zigzag back in time, revisiting the same events from different perspectives, adding layers upon layers, which can all make the series really intimidating for those who just want to dip their little toes in. And that's not getting into the author's viewpoints, which, oh my god, just a separate conversation that we're going to get to. But let's stay on track. What are these books even about? Well, the premise is straightforward enough. In the near future, humanity makes first contact with an alien species. But instead of a friendly handshake, the insect-like Formix, or if you're feeling rude, the buggers, introduce themselves with mass murder and large-scale destruction. But hey, you gotta hand it to us humans, if there's one thing we're good at in sci-fi, it's being scrappy, and against all odds, or some might say a loophole, Earth manages to survive and push back the invasion. But that close brush with extinction, yeah, it leaves everyone a little on edge. So the governments of Earth decide they need a stronger defense, and one that involves breeding child geniuses and training them as soldiers and commanders. It's a snappy, simple premise, right? With clear stakes, but what's best is that although that summary might make this seem like an ordinary war story, Ender's Game and the following books are actually quite the opposite. In fact, they are downright philosophical. Now, heads up, major spoilers for Ender's Game and the entire Enderverse pretty much from here on out until maybe the adaptation section. Now, at its core, Ender's Game is basically the story of a 6-year-old being institutionally traumatized for the sake of humanity. Fun times, right? The book follows Ender Wiggin, a brilliant young boy who gets drafted into the orbiting battle school, where Earth's smartest children are molded into future military leaders. From the moment he arrives, it's made clear that Ender isn't just another ordinary student. Instead, he's humanity's best hope against the Formix. So no pressure, right? For Ender, battle school is brutal, isolating, and manipulative. Specifically for Ender, it's designed to break him down and rebuild him as a commander. And at the heart of this training scene is the battle room, which is a massive zero-G arena where students are divided into armies, which basically think Harry Potter houses, but if Gryffindor had to actually fight Slytherin in tactical warfare in zero-G, which would actually be awesome. Anyway, these armies battle it out in increasingly difficult matches, and naturally, Ender absolutely dominates, even at an absurdly young age. He's undefeated, becoming a living legend among the students and gathering a loyal following. But for all his success, Ender suffers. He's deliberately isolated, pushed to his mental and emotional limits, and constantly manipulated by his teachers. And this isn't helped at all by the fact that Ender is a rare third-born child in a society where families are usually only allowed 2 kids. Government only let him exist because they'd hoped he'd be the perfect balance between his ruthless older brother Peter and his overly empathetic sister Valentine. Now, because of his taboo third status, when he's younger, he's tormented constantly, and in one of the most shocking moments in the book, he straight up kills a fellow student in self-defense in an event that was intentionally engineered by his instructors, who conveniently looked the other way while all this was happening. And let's be real, although this book is technically aimed at younger readers, it is brutal. Right from the very first pages, Ender, at 6 years old, deals with a bully in the most hardcore way possible. In a calculated move, he savagely beats his tormentor to death to send a message, and later, in a surreal video game designed to analyze his psyche, he gets stuck in an unwinnable scenario where a giant blocks his progress. So Ender's solution is to use his in-game mouse avatar to, quote, dig into the giant's eye like cottage cheese, end quote, which is a line that has stuck with me in the worst possible way throughout the years whenever I look at cottage cheese. Anyway, eventually Ender is sent to command school, where he's put through a final series of simulated battles against the legendary commander and hero from the First Formic War, Mazer Rackham, which is such a cool name, right? Now he's training alongside his most trusted friends from battle school, with the final test being a no-win scenario where he's outnumbered 1,000,000 and manages to scrape a victory through a super brazen move involving destroying the enemy's home planets. Except it wasn't a simulation. Turns out Ender had been commanding the real fleet against the bugger homeworld the entire time, so he didn't just pass a test, he killed an entire species, which score 1 for humanity and negative 1,000,000 for Ender's mental health. But this is where Ender's Game does something most war stories don't. Instead of coming home as a celebrated hero, Ender is shattered. The years of manipulation, the isolation, the guilt of unknowingly wiping out an entire species, it all breaks him. And after all, he's still a child at this point. So instead of returning home to bask in his victory, he distances himself and eventually dedicates his life to atonement and empathy. Now, if you are one of those people who found these deeper themes one of the most intriguing parts about the book, there's good news for you, because the rest of the series doubles down on them. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the very first sequel, Speaker of the Dead, which was written just 1 year after Ender's Game. Now, considering the short turnaround time, it's a complete 180 in the best way imaginable. It shifts the entire tone and focus of the series into something truly philosophical, and it's almost a masterpiece in how it explores morality, culture, and redemption. Now, interestingly enough, Card came up with Speaker of the Dead before Ender's Game, and only after writing Ender's Game did it occur to him that Ender would be the perfect protagonist for it. It also really shows off Card's versatility as a writer. So basically, the plot is that we're now thousands of years removed from the destruction of the buggers, and thanks to space travel shenanigans, Ender is still alive, but instead of being hailed as a hero, he's now infamous, and known as the Xenocide, the killer of the Formic race. Now, in Ender's Game, there was a whole subplot about the bugger hive queen trying to communicate with Ender. She left behind a single queen egg to him, which was the last hope for her species. Meanwhile, on a distant colony world, humanity encounters another alien race called the Piggies, which are seemingly primitive, strange, and full of mystery. Now, the Speaker of the Dead unfolds all of this in a super interesting, layered, intricate puzzle delving into the Piggies' culture and the legacy of the buggers, and even an advanced AI. And while Ender's Game had flashy battles and a coming-of-age arc, this book is a slow burn, much more adult in tone, heavy on philosophy, religion, and deep moral questions. And the rest of the Ender series continues this trend. That being said, some people do struggle with these later books, especially Children of the Mind, which kind of collapses under the weight of its own themes, characters, and ideas. And honestly, I get it. If you came into the series expecting more Ender's Game, the shift can be jarring. So while Ender's Game is sharp, focused, and intense, the sequels are different, especially when you consider that there is just some absolutely wild going on. Now, I could go on and on about this, but let's just pull a few random moments out of the box, shall we? Like, how about the moment where Ender literally splits into 3 people? Or how about how 2 of those people just so happen to be perfect younger copies of his siblings? Or how about how one of those siblings is still alive and meets this weird younger version of herself? Or how Ender's adopted son falls in love with that younger clone of Ender's sister, who, by the way, because she's basically a version of Ender, means he's kind of falling in love with his dad. And if that's not weird enough, the whole incest-adjacent relationship thing happens more than once in the series. Like, that same adopted son convinces an AI god into taking over the clone of Ender's sister he's in love with because he's also kind of in love with the AI god. Yeah, man, it's weird. And then there's Petra and Bean, which, oh boy, they're side characters in Ender's Game and main characters of the Shadow series. And Petra, despite being significantly older, repeatedly pressures Bean into having babies with her. And Bean, by the way, is canonically like really young when this starts, but to be fair, there is some discrepancy in his actual age at this point. Anyway, did I mention that there are also talking birds? Yeah, we truly got it all here. Now, I don't want to make it sound like the whole series is just unhinged nonsense, because it's actually very cohesive and good weird most of the time, but on top of the general weirdness, it can just be overwhelming. Because bear in mind, the Ender books, like the books focusing on Ender himself, are just a fraction of the series. Like, the entire Ender's series is actually huge, and one of the most fascinating aspects of Ender's Game is its world building, which is really interesting and has some facets that are unlike any other series out there. For example, space travel. Unlike in many sci-fi universes where interstellar travel is kind of glossed over or hand-waved away, in Card's world, space travel is slow, like decades and decades. But actually, it kind of depends. Like, if you're on a planet, it takes decades, but if you're on the ship, it just takes a few weeks. And this is a major plot point affecting everything from how slowly Ender ages or how long space fleets take to arrive at their destinations. It's also really interesting how prescient Card was in predicting a lot of technology. For example, Peter and Valentine, Ender's siblings, basically take over the world through ideology using anonymous usernames on the internet in Ender's Game. And bear in mind, Ender's Game came out in 1985, which is basically when the internet was first coming out. And I'm just like imagining in today's world if 2 teenagers took over geopolitics with TikTok, which I wouldn't even be surprised at this point. So hashtag Demosthenes, I guess. And you're amazing if you got that reference, by the way. Anyway, speaking about predicting technology, the emergence of AI and the explorations of morality around that are also explored, with one of the most important characters, Jane, who is essentially the very first conscious AI. And this raises huge philosophical questions about what it means to be human and whether an artificial intelligence can have consciousness or a soul, which, yeah, feels eerily spot on in today's world. Now, pound for pound, Ender's Game is packed with a ton of these really interesting themes and ideas, and honestly, it's hard to even touch on all of them that come out throughout the series. But one of the most striking aspects is the exploration of child soldiers. In a way, the entire premise is about kids being groomed to become cold-blooded killers for the quote-unquote greater good. And this is interesting because if there was an existential threat to humanity and making innocent children into essentially genocide machines, would the ends justify the means? And this ties into the mirroring question, is genocide ever okay? Which on face value is a wild question to ask, but the Endersverse presents this question with the Buggers, which are aliens that are seemingly bent on humanity's total destruction. And if that were the case, would it be okay to utterly destroy them too? And I think it's no coincidence that they're so insect-like and alien to us. And this ties into another central theme of empathy. If we were able to communicate with those that we see as alien, would our understanding of them shift? And again, it's no coincidence that Ender's superpower as a commander isn't really strategy, but rather understanding. He can understand his enemies and love them, and by doing so, he knows how to defeat them. Now, these ideas about empathy and understanding isn't just on the community level, it's also on the individual level, with the characters grappling with ideas about the self, connection, and the nature of existence, with exploration into issues of individuality versus collective existence, and the connection between all living things, including another major theme of the books, which is about marriage, reproduction, and societal roles. Every race in the book has its own customs on this. humanity, the Formics, and especially with the piggies, with their own fascinating and very different mating customs, with males kind of revering but also literally afraid of females, which, same. But these discussions even spill into fascinating conversations between the hive mind and the piggies, where they discuss marriage and reproduction in human terms, and how marriage and children is essentially a trap for the individual. And it's just really interesting to see their ideas on, from their perspective, these seemingly very alien humans, and it's all just great stuff. You can tell Card was building the Enderverse with the mindset of how he could make the biggest playground for his philosophical and moral ideas, and as such, every world gets settled by its own culture and religion. Now, religion isn't just used for world building, it's deeply embedded in the themes and characters, and this I think is super interesting because in a lot of sci-fi, you rarely see a world where religion is depicted with such nuance. Usually in a lot of modern media, it's portrayed as something that's exploiting people or just simply misguided. But in Card's world, religion plays a different role, and it's deeply connected to the values and the worldview of the characters. And on this note, it's no secret that Card is, I'm sorry I can't help myself, a card-carrying member of the Latter-day Saints, aka a Mormon. But Card is a guy who's not shy about voicing his opinions, and some of those opinions have definitely stirred up a lot of controversy. The most well-known and infamous of these is his public support for laws against same-sex marriage, which understandably has sparked a ton of debate among fans. Now, I'd highly recommend reading Card's essay on this for yourself. They're long, but it's honestly just fascinating to see his mindset and even reaction to the backlash, and I'll link some of these below if you're interested in getting the full picture. Now, this issue came to a head when the Ender's Game movie was in production, leading to calls for boycotts both of the books and the film due to Card's view. But what's interesting to me is that although his views on gay marriage are controversial, he also has hundreds of other controversial and very public ideas. So if you check out his website, there's a section called, quote, Uncle Orson Reviews Everything, end quotes, and it's just as wild as it sounds. You can view his thoughts on Obama, COVID, movies, or even more nuanced things like his opinions on crazy rich Asians and the proper use of the word masseuse. Now, as far as his actual writing, like the writing of his books, his works pull influences from almost everywhere, and a lot of these are shaped by, of course, his own diverse life experiences. Take his time in Brazil, for example. He was a missionary there, and that likely played a key part in the creation of the Lusitania colony in Speaker of the Dead, and how it's filled with Portuguese. Now, Card has suffered multiple personal tragedies throughout his life, including the loss of children, and you can see these themes of loss, sacrifice, and the search of meaning woven throughout his work. Interestingly enough, Card didn't actually start as a sci-fi writer. He was a theater major making plays, but as he put it, it wasn't really paying the bills, which led him to pivot to writing, of course, Ender's Game, which actually started as a short story. Now, when it comes to Ender's Game, one of the key influences was Card's own thoughts on being drafted at the then Vietnam War. Specifically, he was thinking about what it would be like to undergo basic training in the future, especially in the context of a potential space war. So the battle training in Ender's Game was inspired by the way the very first pilots in World War I were trained and how they were trying to understand for the very first time thinking in another dimension, which is super interesting. Now, if all this talk of sci-fi and philosophy has got you thirsty, and you want to drink out of something just as epic, I present to you Handy Goblin. Handy Goblin makes gorgeous handcrafted mugs straight out of a tabletop campaign. Made in Australia from high-quality stoneware, these mugs are tough, gorgeous, and unique. You got all types of fun fantasy designs in here that any nerd in your life will most likely be into, with my personal favorite being the good old Mimic mug. Now, it's clear the folks at Handy Goblin put a ton of love into making each and every one, right down to the packaging. They're perfect for treating yourself or as a gift for that special adventurer in your life who deserves something a bit special. So check out Handy Goblin in the link below and let me know which one's your favorite. Okay, so what actually makes up the Ender's Game series? Well, like with everything in Ender's Game, it's a bit of a mess, confusing, sprawling, and unlike pretty much anything else out there. Now, on paper, there are 16 books in total, which sounds manageable, right? Except not really, because tonally and chronologically, they're all over the place. If you love one book, there's no guarantee that you're going to love another. If you hate one, you might still adore a different one. But since a lot of these books don't directly rely on each other, you can often skip the ones that don't work for you. So at a high level, the series can be broken down down into 3 main sub-series. The Ender Saga, which roughly follows Ender himself, the Shadow Saga, focusing on Bean and the events back on Earth, and finally the Formic Wars, which is a prequel series covering the very first war with the Buggers. Now, as far as the Ender series, or the Ender's Quartet as it's also known, it follows Ender. And as I mentioned before, these books jump around tonally and thematically. A lot of people read Ender's Game as kids, but the rest of these are not children's books. But to be fair, neither was Ender's Game really, it just happened to be more accessible, I guess. But moving on, Speaker of the Dead, Xenocide, and Children of the Mind are slower and filled with themes that most younger readers might not really vibe with, which is probably why, unfortunately, a lot of people never really move past the first book, even though they might appreciate Speaker more if they read it later in life. That being said, as I mentioned before, a lot of people think the later books in this series, specifically Children of the Mind, go off the rails, introducing too many characters, too many ideas, and just too much general shenanigans, like, the whole Ender literally splitting into 3 different people at one point. But if all that philosophy and slow burn world building sounds like a slog, don't worry, because much later, Ender in Exile came out, jumping back in the timeline to right after the events of Ender's Game. It's much more straightforward and action-focused, kind of serving as a bridge between Ender's Game and Speaker for the Dead. But also, in some people's opinion, it's more of a shadow book dealing with direct plot threads from Shadow of the Giant and containing a bunch of spoilers for the Shadow books, so some people do recommend to read it after Shadow of the Giant. So if that's still not enough Enderverse for you, don't worry, because we also got the Shadow series, which takes yet another complete 180 in tone, pacing, themes, and even again chronologically. The first book, Ender's Shadow, slaps us right back into the events of Ender's Game, except this time it's all from Bean's perspective, which is a really interesting idea because it's essentially a retelling of the first book. Now, interestingly enough, this was originally supposed to be written from another author, but the more Card talked about it, the more he realized that he needed to be the one to write this book. Now, unlike the Ender Saga, which goes deep into philosophy and interstellar ethics, the Shadow series stays closer to home, quite literally. Most of it focuses on Earth's political turmoil, the rise of the hegemon, and the aftermath of the war against the Buggers, and it basically focuses on Bean, Peter, Petra, and the Battle School grads and how they got wrapped up in all of Earth's fun geopolitics. In many ways, it's closer in tone to Ender's Game itself, but there's also some general Enderverse shenanigans in here. And speaking of that, we've got to talk about The Last Shadow, which was meant to tie everything together, but a lot of people found it kind of baffling. And this was because this was supposed to be the book that kind of finishes the plot hooks from both the Ender series and the Shadow series. And bear in mind, the last book in the Ender series came out in 1996, and The Last Shadow came out in 2021, so people had been waiting over a decade for a resolution. Now, some people did see it as a satisfying conclusion, others think it completely undercut everything that came before it, and actually just talking about the controversy of this book alone could be a video unto itself. But hey, that's Ender's Game for you, nothing is ever simple. And because this series just loves to jump around in the timeline, we also have the Formic Wars series, which is a prequel series that takes us all the way back to humanity's very first encounter with the Formics and the war that kicked off the series. Now, these are packed with action, large-scale battles, and a fresh perspective on a story that had always been background lore in the main series. It's also worth mentioning that the Formic Wars was written in collaboration with Aaron Johnston, who seems to be doing the bulk of the writing, and had been working on a comic book series covering the same events, which we'll talk about soon. Now, this gives the series a slightly different feel, one that's more cinematic and structured like a classic war epic. It's a solid addition to the Enderverse, giving depth to one of its most important figures while fleshing out the war that shaped everything that came after. But my friends, if you thought we were done and dusted and that this was all pretty straightforward, oh no, we're not nearly finished yet, because on top of everything else, there's also a pretty significant chunk of spin-off books and short stories, and honestly, a lot of these are pretty good. First up, we have Children of the Fleet in 2017, which was a standalone novel that takes us back to Battle School with a ton of references and tie-ins to other books. It was originally meant to be the start of its own series, but that, as well as a planned video game for this set in Battle School, never really panned out. And then there's a scattered collection of over 10 short stories. And some of these are really solid, and many are available for free online. I'll link a great Reddit post in the description that compiles these if you're interested. And if all of that wasn't already confusing and all over the place enough, there's also a collection of essays titled Ender's World: Fresh Perspectives on the SF classic Ender's Game. Basically, it's a collection of essays from different writers and military strategists analyzing some aspects of the first novel. So, to sum this all up, we've got different novels, short stories, sub-series, and within those, the timeline jumps all over the place. So the question is, how are you supposed to read all of these? Well, like with a lot of series out there, you basically have two choices. One, you could read them in publication order, which lets you experience the information as it was released, while also giving you a fascinating look at how Card's writing style and philosophical beliefs evolved over the course of 30 plus years. Now, the downside is that if you try to read these chronologically, by the time you get to one book, you might have forgotten half of what happened in another because these books jump around like crazy. So to fix this, you could also be a brave soul and attempt to read it all in chronological order, which at first glance looks like a complete nightmare to untangle. But thank God for the internet, because again, the incredible iBlit has created an amazing detailed breakdown of the entire reading order, including which books are required, recommended, and optional. And you'll notice that the Ender's Game book is kind of the ultimate starting point for all of these, and everything branches out from there. It's a lifesaver for anyone trying to navigate the maze that is the Enderverse. So with the massive generation-spanning success of Ender's Game, you best believe Hollywood was dying to get this book onto the big screen. But was that a good thing? Well, let's talk about it. Now, plenty of adaptations get mangled because the author gets shoved aside in favor of studio execs chasing trends, but Card was not about to let that happen. The man held onto the film rights for decades, turning down deal after deal because he refused to let Hollywood age up the characters or shoehorn in a love story, which is a bit ironic, not to give too many spoilers here. But eventually, all the stars seemingly aligned, and in 2013, the Ender's Game movie finally happens. But right away, there were some major challenges. One of the most pressing was that most of the book takes place inside Ender's head, so this was going to be hard to translate to the film, which Card originally envisioned as fixing by making this more of a buddy movie with Ender kind of competing but also confiding in Bean. And yeah, you can tell that never really happened, and there are also some deeper issues here, but let's start with the good. The special effects are gorgeous, and the ships, the battles, the zero-gravity combat all look fantastic. The battle room in particular is absolutely breathtaking. But for every cool visual, there's something kind of off. A lot of people criticize the acting, which, yeah, fair, but you also have to wonder how much of that was the director's fault because the movie just feels so rushed. And then there are just some general weird choices, like why does the Salamander army have a random hype song? Why is Ender out here doing push-ups like he's training for the Marines? And the biggest WTF, why is Ender gun-fooing through the battle room? It's just confusing. Anyway, Petra gets a much bigger role here and is kind of shoehorned in as a love interest, which again was a studio thing. But overall, the movie isn't terrible. It's not even the worst adaptation we could have gotten. It just feels lukewarm, and that's a shame because there were big plans to turn this into a whole franchise. But the film bombed at the box office, and it didn't help that a lot of people boycotted it due to Card's, let's call them, controversial opinions. And in fact, the producers had to put out statements saying that Card wouldn't profit from the film, but it was too little too late, and the Ender's Game movie was dead on arrival. But even though the Ender's Game movie never turned into some sprawling cinematic franchise, don't get too sad, because another adaptation actually did, one that covered way more of the series, even diving into short stories and prequel material. And I'm of course talking about the Ender's Game comics, which, yeah, Marvel Comics themselves picked up the series in 2008, and every issue has Card's name on it. Now, he didn't personally write them, but he oversaw the whole process to make sure everything lined up with his vision, and honestly, there are a ton of these. Some of them are direct adaptations of the books, like Ender's Game itself, but others go way beyond it or dive into completely new material, like one about Valentine navigating her own struggles back on Earth. The comics are actually a great way to explore the Enderverse, and they really capture a surprisingly large amount of the story. Now, the art style is interesting. It's got this glassy, almost plastic look that might not be for everyone, but it definitely doesn't shy away from the violence. Now, the books are still the best way to experience the story, hands down, but the comics do add a lot. They kind of fill in background details and really help visualize characters and bring the world to life in a way that the books just can't. Unfortunately, it doesn't really look like we're gonna get any more of these given the long hiatus, with the last one being made in 2012, which is a bit of a shame. But if you're a comic book person and you've never checked them out, they're honestly a great way to experience the world of Ender's Game. And again, it's kind of a shame a lot of people don't realize that these exist, but they're definitely worth a look, if only to finally see how some of these worlds and species actually look on the page. Now, I don't know exactly when this started happening. Maybe it was cyberpunk edge runners that kind of kicked it off, but it's definitely become a trend for people to desperately want anime adaptations of pretty much everything. And yeah, I'm probably guilty of that too. So for anyone out there thinking, man, an anime of Ender's Game would be awesome, well, funnily enough, we kind of already got one. In a bizarre turn of fate, there was actually an Ender's Game manga released in 2014. And I'll be real with you, I have no idea how this happens. I tried looking into it, but there's barely any information out there. But before you get too excited, this wasn't some long-running high-quality adaptation, it was more of a one-off experiment. The manga closely follows the aesthetic and plot of the movie, which did we really need another retelling of Ender's Game? But anyway, only the first issue ever came out, and everything about it feels really subdued. It honestly almost feels unfinished. There's barely any color, the length is super short, and it all feels really incomplete. But if you're frustrated at the lack of adaptations or the movie, you weren't the only one, because apparently Card was upset about it, and well, he did something about it and decided to make an audio play. Now this is called Ender's Game Alive, and it's over 7 hours in length, and it's actually way more than just another retelling of Ender's Game. It hints at storylines from some of the short stories, and it's also got some great production value and voice actors, including the incredible Stefan Rudnicki, who did Colonel Graf for the audiobooks, which as a side note are great too. But Rudnicki has just an amazing sexy Graf voice, and you gotta check it out. So this brings us to the big question, are we finally done with the Ender's Game series? Which, by the way, is nearly 40 years old at this point. Well, maybe? If you were paying attention to the release timeline, you probably noticed that these books never really stopped coming out. The most recent entry, The Last Shadow in 2021, wrapped up a lot of the lingering plot lines from both the Ender and Shadow series, for better or worse. But that might not be the final word, because there's still The Queen, which is the planned third and final novel in the second Formic War trilogy. That being said, we haven't heard much about it since 2022, when Aaron Johnston, the co-creator and writer of the comics, mentioned he had to slow down due to other work. Now, as of this video, there's been no official release date, no announcements, nothing, and Card himself has seemingly moved on to other projects. So while the door isn't officially closed, it's not exactly wide open either. And in a weird twist of fate, one of the biggest Ender's Game related headlines in recent years wasn't even about a new book or adaptation, it was actually about a painting. In 2023, the original cover art for the 1985 novel sold at an auction for over 10 times its estimated value. Apparently someone really wanted a piece of sci-fi history on their wall, which I kinda understand. And as a quick tangent, if you're ever wondering why the cover art in a lot of the Ender series is never really related to anything in the books, it's because the original cover for Ender's Game was actually intended for an entirely other sci-fi book series and just got recycled. Now, beyond that news, the most notable recent releases was a limited collector's edition of Speaker of the Dead in 2021. This had some pretty cool illustrations and even an interview with Card. There's also a scattering of other special editions and even a special gold and gilded signed editions for the die-hard fans out among you. Speaking of merchandise, there's also official Ender's Game gear and products, like the Salamander Army travel mug, which if I saw someone sipping from, I would completely lose my And while the Ender's Game fandom might not be as loud or chaotic as, say, Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, there's still plenty of passion to go around. From incredible fan art to surprisingly good fan fiction, and yes, even an Ender's Game Terra deck, because why not, the series has left a lasting mark. In fact, it's had such an impact that it was even used at one point to help train young Marine officers. Now, this all begs the question, why? What is it about this series that's made it such a sci-fi touchstone over the years? Well, aside from its huge influence on the genre, is it the strategic brilliance, the psychological depth, the moral dilemmas, or just the undeniable coolness of zero-gravity laser tag? Probably it's all of the above, with its staggering mix of big ideas, philosophy, and wildly different focuses across its books, series, and spin-offs. There's almost something for everyone here, and there's always some new idea or sci-fi concept to unpack and pick through. And with that in mind, it's kind of no wonder that the series has stuck around for as long as it has. So, in conclusion, what can I say? If the odds are stacked 1,000,000 to 1 against you, just remember that the enemy's gate is down. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the help and support. I want to give a huge shout out to iBlid, who helped me so much with fact checking and bouncing ideas off of. He is an amazing source of information for the Ender's Game community and also the Aragon community. I want to give another shout out to Bad Benito, who also helped me a lot with fact checking. And finally, another shout out to Quadpin, who again helped with fact checking. As always, no shout out is ever complete with shouting out my incredible patrons who keep this channel alive. Seriously, you guys are the best, and I could not do this without you. If you want to find out more ways to support me on Patreon, you can check out the links in the description below. And as always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really interesting to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye.